Hello. So today and over the next couple of days, I'm going to talk to you about parasites. So I'm going to talk about some endo and some ecto parasites. So endoparasites just means parasites in the body. Ectoparasites means parasites on the body. Now, when we're talking about endoparasites, there's kind of 4 typical worms that we'll talk about in cats and dogs, and then there's some other parasites we'll talk about. But the most common worms are going to be roundworms, hookworms, whipworms, and tapeworms. I'm going to talk to you about all of them individually, but before I do that, I'm going to say that we typically find these worms on what we call a fecal exam. So when you go in for an annual exam at your vet and they say they're going to do a fecal or a deworm, that's what they're usually looking for, are these worms. And there's multiple different ways to do a fecal on an animal. So the most common way is to do what's called a fecal float. So that's where you take a fecal sample, we will put it in a little tube, and we will mix it with a float material that is usually some kind of solution that has a sugar quality to it. And what we're trying to do when we do that is we're looking for the eggs of the parasite, not the actual worms themselves. Your goal is that your eggs will float to the very top of that medium. We will put a little slide on top of it and hope that it catches the eggs for that. It's not a perfect test because you get a lot of issues with certain mediums that the eggs are too heavy to float to the top, or you only get certain ones that float. If you happen to test whenever the adult worms are not producing eggs, it won't show up on the test even if they have an active infection. Or if you get a worm that has a very low egg count, it won't show up on the test. Some clinics will take that fecal sample, put it in a little bit of the material, and actually spin it down in a centrifuge, which makes it a little more accurate to read that test. It does take a little bit longer to do that. And nowadays, we actually have some tests. I believe one at the lab is called a key screen test, where you can send out and it looks for actual like PCR, looking at almost the DNA of the parasite to find it. That is a little bit more sensitive, and you can find some low-grade infections that way that you're not going to find on an in-house test. So there's kind of pros and cons of all of them involved. The in-house test is really nice. You can do it relatively quickly, but it's just not a perfect test. That is why sometimes you will be suspicious of your pet having parasites. They'll get a fecal exam and it'll come back negative, since it is not that perfect test, but it's a great screening test for our typical annual stuff. Now, typically we will want to do that fecal before we do a dewormer because there are so many dewormers out there that cover so many different things, so it's kind of hard to give a one-size-fits-all dewormer. But coming up, I'll be talking about our big 4 on our worms and some other internal parasites that we face commonly in cats and dogs.